everyone. I'm very excited to be here talking again at Black Hat for the second time this week. This is Orange is the New Purple, and I'm April. And today we're going to consider how we can build more secure software by integrating builder teams, software developers, engineers, architects, with security. You've probably noticed that security doesn't always see eye to eye with other teams. It's true, actually, we don't see eye to eye, and we don't speak the same language in a lot of cases. For us, it's deceptively simple. We want to start with a secure product. We want to keep it secure. We want to be able to tell people it's secure and prove it's secure for compliance. And for goodness sake, we want to shut it down when it's no longer able to be secured. For the application builders, the software creators, they have very different goals. They worry about tight deadlines and really just making their code work. And if you've ever written code, you probably know that that's the most important and most difficult part. There's really no room for security in this model, and security ends up being an afterthought in a lot of cases. The other issue is that we have a fairly valid image problem. Once a year, sometimes, if we're lucky, once a quarter, security will come in for an audit, a pen test, some consulting. We tear apart the builder's work. We criticize their art. And I do believe that code is art. Our weapons are our findings, and it's really us versus them. There's no teamwork. It's a battle. It's easy to see why we could potentially be perceived as negative or annoying in that case, because instead of giving kudos when something was done right, we give them a spreadsheet and tickets and things to fix and more work to do. The status quo is just not working, and it's not helping us build more secure software at all. Why do we have such different goals, and can we productively work together? I have some ideas, but who am I to offer them to you? I've done a little bit of everything. I'm not an expert in any one thing. I try to learn as much about every single thing as possible. I love to learn. I've been a developer, a Unix admin, blue team, compliance. It's actually easier for me to list off what I haven't done than what I have. I wear many hats in the security world. From all of my experiences, I really believe that creating secure software from the beginning and then testing to make sure that it's secure is the way to go for the most secure software. I have first-hand insight into these topics from many different perspectives. And besides having different goals, we also have different challenges. For instance, we can't secure what we don't know about. We don't know what's out there. We don't know the libraries that are being used. We don't know the functions that are being called. But the builders know this, and they can help us. They know how everything works. They know what libraries they've used and what queries they've implemented. We tend to be really shocked when things aren't done securely. It seems so simple to us. Like, why didn't they just do it the way we wanted them to do it? Like, they should know better. We can't keep up with Agile and other methodologies. If there's a 2-week release cycle, we can't do penetration testing in that time. It's just not possible. And as Sand says, it's strikingly apparent that security is a silo of knowledge. And I believe that this starts in education, where curriculum does not include security throughout the coursework. It's not sprinkled in with all of the day-to-day activities that they perform. It's often an elective, a standalone course. So a lot of developers have really just not been exposed to any of the things that we're talking about, and it makes it really difficult for us, and it makes it really difficult for them to build secure software. So if security only audits once a year, who's in charge of the other 11 months? The builders. That's why it's so extremely critical that we fix this. We need to be on the same team. Security can improve software by partnering with the builders, not policing them. We do have a secret shared goal that I didn't mention, and it's also a challenge. We're all trying to make the organization and ourselves successful. Builders want to do things securely, but they don't have the resources to do so today. Whether it's time, knowledge, or leeway from management, but we like to share our knowledge, and we have a lot of it. We find ourselves talking security with anybody who will listen. I talk to taxi drivers all the time about what ransomware is and how to protect themselves. We love to talk shop with people, and I think what we need to do is create more opportunities for builders to listen. We can, as with all things security, fix this with a triangle. We love our triangles. We need to consider builders as part of the same team as us, their prime resource, the front lines of defense. Just some quick terminology. When I'm talking about red team here, I'm talking about any kind of offensive testing. I'm talking about pen testing, vulnerability scanning, manual code reviews. I call this team the breakers. The blue team is detection. It's forensics. It's incident response. I call these the guardians. And I'd like to talk about the yellow team today. These are the app developers, the software engineers, designers, architects, coders. These are the builders that I've been talking about. Now that we've given them a color and we've brought them into our fancy world of triangles, let's talk about color really quickly. Red, yellow, and blue are primary colors, as you probably know, and when you mix a primary color with another primary color, you get a secondary color. So that's really the important thing to remember here is that additive principle. Purple team is not a new concept. It's a great example of joining forces to create a same team mindset, but it has a lot of limitations. It doesn't address the upstream source of vulnerabilities. Where are they coming from and why are there so many? There's also an inherent delay between vulnerability inception into code and vulnerability identification by a red team. We're also essentially looking for known vulnerabilities. So a security program that relies purely on offensive testing to secure its software is kind of like trying to remove the needles from a haystack. Most of us understand red, blue, purple, so let's talk about orange and green. Software defenders and software creators should be meeting and talking much more often than we are today. We should be like chatty best friends instead of frenemy pen pals. We can do great things together if we work together. So the orange team is really red showing yellow what dangers lurk below. Yellow continuously is exposed to real-world threats, not just as a bug, but we need to teach them the nature of the vulnerabilities. This knowledge can then be incorporated when yellow performs their function, which is building the software. Yellow must be able to think like an attacker to create proper defenses. Yellow can model possible threats and to what they're working on, and an open door policy between teams allows collaboration to address any possible threats. Red should ideally never find the same vulnerability twice from the same yellow team. And if that happens, more education is required, and management really needs to step in and promote security in the processes. When a yellow team discusses a security issue that was found by red, they may realize that the same or a very similar issue can be found elsewhere. It might be in the same application, or it might be in an application that's completely separate or completely outside of the scope of the red engagement. If yellow considers security to be mandatory or a necessary evil or eventually, hopefully, a really good idea, and if they're aware and educated about the threats that they're facing, then their idea of correctness in code will become synonymous with secure code. It's always better to prevent a bug than to find it and fix it later. But every bug should be a learning experience. It shouldn't be an embarrassment. It shouldn't be a negative experience for them. Yellow will create how they want. And if yellow is empowered by leadership to embrace security and given the resources to do so, then yellow can build securely. And by developing a threat-based mindset in the builders, yellow can prevent many vulnerabilities. Green is really all about facilitating improvements in all of the blue functions. And what does blue want? They want to know who, what, when, where. This capability can be improved based on either red-purple findings or known limitations. if detection isn't as good as it should be, if increased insight is needed into high-risk areas, it can be added. Also, logs can come out standardized with all the important info and be really easy to plug into SIEM technology instead of having to fiddle with it every time. Blue also gains a better understanding of the functions and intricacies of an application, which helps with incident response and forensics. Insight into use, misuse, and abuse can be thoughtfully crafted to provide better protections for the application. Enhanced logging for security-relevant functions can be implemented, and traps can be set up to catch attackers. Integration between software and automation is also magical. You can auto-block, you can auto-debug, you can auto-report. It's all possible. One of the first hurdles that you will need to jump through in implementing this is really setting expectations. We know what a secure end state looks like, but we need to explain to the builders and project managers how we get there. So Sdlc checklists really help everyone understand what to expect. And I know that checklists are kind of groan-worthy at times, but getting involved during the early phases of Sdlc ensures that security is built in as it needs to be. First, remember to get your management on board. Make sure that they are ready to back you when you present these expectations as requirements to the project management organization, or PMO, and the builders. There may be some pushback initially. It's more work. It takes time. So having management on your side really helps things go smoothly. Building an Sdlc program that includes security requires critical thinking and a lot of creativity. If you don't know where to start, search for sample Sdlc phase checklists online, and you can tailor them to your needs. Not everything will be applicable to your project, but you can pick and choose what you want to include. I'm going to give you some examples of checklists in a moment. The PMO also needs to understand what we need from them or anyone else. They can drive stakeholders to complete items and tasks, and we can support them. The PMO will start gathering requirements and come up with a projected completion date pretty early on. So we really need our requirements to be included before that happens. You may not know initially how long a checklist item will take to achieve, but this becomes tuned with process maturity. Your best guess is good enough initially. Again, policy is your friend. Policy and process should dictate that security be a mandatory stakeholder at the beginning of a process. And this is where management support is vitally important. A privacy questionnaire is a great way to learn about the application that you're trying to secure and all of the important things that are within it. This is a living document. We need to keep this up to date throughout the Sdlc. The privacy assessment should identify stakeholders, people who know about what the data in the application is, where it will be stored, how it's going to be processed. Legal is always a stakeholder in privacy, and engineers and architects are as well. We need to list and document any PII or protected, personally identifiable information, proprietary data, confidential data, highly confidential data, anything that will exist within the application. And if you don't already have a policy that defines these sensitivity levels, now is a really good time to create one. Where sensitive data will be stored and transmitted determines the footprint you're trying to protect with the most resources. You don't want to spend all of your time and effort on inconsequential things. So we need to define the mitigations that will be used to protect the data. Do we need encrypted database fields, IPsec tunnels, a DMZ? If we analyze the risk of the data being exposed, who would be affected? What's the opportunity for attackers? We can threat model to find this out. Analyzing the risk of the data being exposed is also extremely important. You need to know what would happen if there was an exposure. Do you need to notify users in certain states? Are there additional compliance requirements for international deployments? Talk to legal about this, as they will have the biggest concern in this area. Be sure to revisit the privacy questionnaire at the end of each phase of the Sdlc and update it as needed. We can set expectations for everyone involved with checklists, because when PMs, management, builders, and even security understands what exactly needs to be done and when, it makes things scalable and manageable. Other teams won't feel as if we're causing scope creep, and we won't negatively impact deadlines. As your checklists mature, many of the tasks will become fairly hands-off for us, and the PM can really drive them. If you're like me and you have no idea how to use Microsoft Project, or if you don't even know what a Gantt chart is, it's totally fine. You can start with a spreadsheet. You can start with a Word document. Just make a list, a bulleted list, an outline of what needs to be done. And you can work with a PM later to turn it into a project plan. So the first step of any project is to involve security. This is the primary reason that we need PMs to understand that security is a required part of all projects. Discuss what's being developed, what's really being developed. Who is likely to use it? Who do you want to use it? The target market will help you identify your compliance goals, review the business plan of the project so you understand the user base and the overall goals. If compliance is a requirement, create a compliance timeline. Will you need to procure funding for third-party auditors? How long will it take to perform the audit? Work backwards from the goal. Compliance may not be possible with the initial prototype, but you can roadmap to compliance, and you can do a soft launch in lieu of a fully compliant solution on day one. The security advocate who is engaged by the PMO will need to provide use cases. Security use cases, not functional use cases. And then the PM can determine a plan for the concept, timeline, and budget. Ideally, you want to have a set of use cases that are generic enough to be reused in any project. Keep in mind that the samples I'm going to show you today are not exhaustive. They're not complete. They're meant to give you an idea of the kinds of things that would appear in each checklist. A use case, as you may know, is a formal specification of required functionality. If you work with Sdlc, you may have encountered them, but a use case generally refers to functionality rather than security. So what is a misuse case? It's basically the opposite of a use case. It's a formal specification of thinking like an attacker. It's a use case, but with an undesired outcome. The acceptance criteria for a misuse case is formally defined as something a malicious user should not be able to do. Both use and misuse cases are testable. Without being able to verify them, how will you know if you've met the use case conditions? You will almost definitely need to explain misuse cases to everyone because it's not something that PMs and software engineers generally use today. Ideas for reusable use cases can come from many different places, including your own imagination, but one really great resource is the Cloud Security Alliance's Cloud Control Matrix, or CCM. This is what the CCM looks like. It offers a statement in the control specification that is generic enough to be applicable to multiple compliances, not just cloud, but everything. Some are required by FISMA and PCI or HIPAA and ISO. The control specification is basically a generic use case and acceptance criteria all in one, except it's worded inappropriately and they really need to be uncoupled to create a proper use case. The Cloud Security Alliance works extremely hard to map these and make sure that the multitude of compliances that an organization might see are included. Anything from NERC-CIP to PCI, each control is mapped to a requirement. And as you scroll across the spreadsheet, you'll have fields that you see here which indicate which compliance is required by which control specification, and it even gives you the number of the section it relates to. As you can see in this example, the second row does not apply to HIPAA, but it does apply to NIST, PCI, and FedRAMP. If you only want to see, for example, PCI, you can filter on that column and look for non-blanks, as any data in the PCI field indicates that the control specification is required by PCI. This makes it really easy. And it's a great tool that you can use to filter controls based on compliance goals that were identified at the beginning of the SDLC. If you do decide to start with the CCM, and again, it's a good start even if you're not using cloud, and once you've filtered on the compliances that are project goals, you'll get a result set of specifications that look like this. This is an example control specification. It's great info, but it's not a use case. It's something we should be doing, but it's not in the format we need for a methodology like Agile. So to create a use case from this control, we separate the acceptance criteria from the use case statement and reword the use case in the as X, I want to Y format. The acceptance criteria is the part of the control that is testable and capable of being verified in some way. In this case, it's the bullets below the control statement. If you want, you can create 2 new columns in the CCM, or you can create a separate spreadsheet and work the control statement, or you can simply use what's here. It's rather simple, but it's honestly somewhat tedious. But once you do it once, you don't have to do it again. Here, I really only needed to separate the first and second part and determine who the use case would apply to, but not every control has acceptance criteria in the CCM, so you may need to think about them and invent some that would apply. The prototype should include our requirements, and like all phases of the SDLC, the design and architecture must be approved by security before moving on to the next phase. We must review and tweak all network and data flow diagrams. Does it need a DMZ? Is there going to be a jump post? Include all interconnections. What are the resources, such as operational monitoring systems, email alerts? What will interface with the architecture? What will the architecture interface with? How will users access it? How will administrators access it? Will admin and user interfaces be separated logically, physically? Diagrams should be extremely detailed in order to minimize changes later. If you find out that you don't have enough switch ports in the rack after you've already purchased all of the gear, that's a really expensive mistake. And it's very costly and difficult to fix. So security must approve at the end of this phase in order to move forward as well. I cannot stress enough the importance of vendor and supply chain management. Third parties and third-party software continue to be a primary vector of attack. Realizing you've chosen the wrong product can be very costly. Even the most securely built application can be undermined by insecurely defined vendor products or services. Third parties should follow secure SDLC as well as us in order to maintain the security posture. To determine this, working sessions with the vendor where you have them sit down and diagram and whiteboard out and explain the data flows and explain the protections live in front of you should be held before any purchases are made. Web meetings are not adequate for this. Interrogate them and find out what's missing or not implemented well. Any vendor product should match as closely as possible the security assurance level of your application. So perform a gap assessment before selecting and definitely before purchasing anything. You'd really be surprised what you might find. I did a gap assessment for an appliance, and I found out that they wrote their own web server and they used passwordless SSH for automation. That was just the beginning. So I'm sure that it was great at what it was supposed to do, but those little things are what can make or break a product. The development and implementation checklist is a mix of things that builders need to do, as well as verification we need to perform. This is the phase where all of the design, architecture, and requirements come together and are actually built. Critical operational controls like monitoring and patching need to be in place when the project is eventually deployed to production. Don't allow it to be added later. Ensure it's working before you go live. During development and implementation, certain elements from design and architecture may need to be changed if they simply don't work. Let's say that encryption of all storage traffic winds up being too costly in terms of performance. Perhaps the storage network can be a separate port on the switch, or a dedicated VLAN, or have further restricted access. Mitigations of this kind need to be documented, and any design changes after the design phase need to be reviewed by all stakeholders, including security. Once verification has occurred and security is comfortable with approving deployment, a push to production can occur. If there are any outstanding concerns, a soft launch can be performed for a limited number of users just to meet that deadline of getting it out the door. We need to provide all checklists that we create up front to the PM so that they can build a project plan that includes them. You can guess at how long something might take. Let's say to add an asset to vulnerability scanning, it takes a couple of days. This will help the PM lay out the timeline, but it probably won't be exact. You should buffer time to account for any delays or problems that may occur. PMs also sometimes do this, so make sure you talk to them to figure out if they're going to buffer your numbers or not. You'll also need to tell the PM how to initiate each action. If there's a specific process, such as adding an asset to a vulnerability management tool, then someone will need to know how this is done. If you need to submit a ticket, if there's an SOP, if there are certain pieces of information that need to be included, like the IP address and physical location. You can absolutely do all of this before a project starts. If you meet with the PMO and explain the requirements, the formats, what a misuse case is, and any other new processes that they'll need to follow. Each checklist may have items that don't apply, and that's fine. You can tailor them by removing or adding requirements based on need or risk. Your very first checklists are going to be incomplete, and that's okay. We have to start somewhere. They will mature over time and get more detailed and comprehensive. Timelines will get more accurate as well. The point of the checklist is to set the expectation that security is going to be part of the SDLC. And going forward, it sets the entire project team up for success. We can't expect PMs and builders to incorporate security from the beginning if we're not involved at that time. Remember that change never happens as quickly as we want it to. Small changes can happen as soon as tomorrow. Start having lunch and learn sessions. Go out to lunch with them. Have a meeting. Talk about what's going on. Just communicate. The extra time and effort are definitely requirements. So being on the same team starts with that leadership buy-in and the allowance of resources that are needed to build secure software. So I suggest that you use policy for any change that you want to initiate, not just this. Policies are extremely powerful. If we break down the silos of knowledge and work together towards a goal and open the lines of communication, we can achieve a great deal. We should be more positive when we interact with the builders, not always negative. We want them to want to work with us. If we sacrifice our time training others, we're rewarded with decreased risk. How do we gain management's buy-in? Well, industry metrics are a good source of data that can be consumed and considered by management before they offer their support. We know, for example, that the cost of a bug increases significantly as the SDLC moves from phase to phase. There are also intangible costs to the organization, such as being in the news or having users not trust your brand. A working risk management program, however basic or advanced, can identify and score risks, which management will need to consider and make choices about. Today we have a gap. We have a divide that separates us to the detriment of security and privacy caused by insecure applications. I always say that it is our duty and our privilege to be able to share our knowledge, and we have a lot of it. When we elevate others through teaching, we elevate not only the person, but ourselves, the entire organization, and the many indirect and direct users of the application. Yellow, orange, green, it's all just a metaphor for us needing to be one team. We want to identify and prevent bugs before they ever become a red team finding or a blue team incident. Security should not be tacked on later. Being a team does not need to be overly formal. In fact, it's better if it's not. If you can roll your chair over to somebody's desk and ask them a question, or log into a collaborative messaging application and just chat, Slack, IRC, something like that. There's really no strict rules here. We just need to work together. So both offensive testing and defensive building should be part of your security strategy. It's not one or the other. Red, blue, purple, they're not replacements for good code, strong architecture, and threat-based design. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions. Yes?
If yellow team failing, green bugs, question code, what kind of corrective measures do you take?
The question is, if yellow keeps creating code even after being educated, what can we do to prevent that? And I think that the ongoing training will help. They're going to make mistakes. There's no such thing as perfectly secure code. There's no such thing as a over-informed developer. Yes?
So I think I understand the misuse cases, and that's something that I was originally trained to do when I was taught programming. But is there a risk that it gets to be a little bit of more of like the firewall where we're trying to list everything that's not allowed to happen, and therefore we're losing things that we're not creative enough to think about instead of just focusing on the use cases?
That's a really good question. I think that the misuse cases are more of a way to make the builders think critically about what they're doing and see the other side of it. Because if they just follow the use cases, they're going to build to the use case and not think about how it could be abused or misused. So I think that, especially for the most important types of functions, that they're really handy and it's a good educational tool.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
In your experience, I have a lot of PMs that I work with, and they look at security. It's exactly what you described. It's you're a burden, you're a weight. They've been there for so long. It's not necessary because they've been there probably since 1960. I'm not even kidding. And when we come to them, they're very negative, and we have to prove to them that security is a value added. Is there a way, in your experience, to deliver that message? Because again, as a blue team, we are, no value added. We're always defending.
That's another good question. I think that that's really where the management buy-in comes in, because if we create that culture of security being important, then it will trickle down. And if they're expected to create secure code and expected to decrease bug counts over time that are related to security, then it will become part of everything that they do. It's really creating a culture where we feel that security is important enough to spend time on and spend resources on. Thank you.
On that question, you talk about management and you've talked about the importance of management buy-in. What happens when you don't have that?
Well, you're much more likely to fail. You're much more likely to, it's going to be an uphill battle.
So obvious question then is, how do you get it? What techniques? I mean, where you've come from, did management just automatically buy in? Hey, we recognize this is important, or did you have to go and sell it? If you did, how did you do it?
So a little bit of both. Sometimes security management, which already understands our needs and goals, can work with the other management teams to ensure that they have buy-in, rather than, so you go up and over and then back down, if that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. And I think that like the metrics and even news stories that are relevant, like anything that happens recently or in the past, like especially like the supply chain type of things, I think that those are really impactful. And making sure that everyone is aware that those things are going on. Like you can even have like a newsletter or something with the what's going on in the world, just to make sure that people are aware of the types of attacks, and make sure that the developers have the time to read something like that, or have the time to talk to us, or we can do like the lunch and learn sessions. Those are really nice. People like those because they don't have to leave their, the confines of the office, and they can grow their breadth and depth. And developers that are security minded make a lot more money. All right, well, thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the con.